Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we complete the first book of Kings, that is the first half of the book of Kings, as we complete chapter 22. Remember, the book of Kings is really one book. It's just divided for convenience purposes into 1 and 2. But it's still something to be proud of that when we complete today's study, we will have finished the entire first book. We left in the last podcast at the end of the very strange encounter between the two kings, that is the king Yehoshaphat of Yehuda and the king Ahab of Israel, of the northern kingdom, both together forming an alliance and about to go to war together against Aram, led by Ben-Hadad. They had asked the prophets, and all of Ahab's sycophantic prophets told him what he wanted to hear, which was, you're going to go and be victorious. And Michayahu came and said the truth, that you may be victorious, but you, Ahab, will meet your death. And Ahab was angry at Michayahu because he told him what he didn't want to hear, and he put Michayahu in prison. At this point, we're about to read verse 29. Vayal melech Yisrael v'Yehoshaphat melech Yehuda Ramot Gilad. And the king of Israel and Yehoshaphat, the king of Yehuda of Judah, went up to Ramot Gilad, where the battle was going to take place, where Ben-Hadad was amassing his forces to fight the people of Israel. The interesting thing, this alliance between Yehoshaphat and Ahab is something worth thinking about, because we finally see what seems to be the potential rapprochement, or the potential reunification of the kingdom here. If Yehoshaphat and Ahab can somehow work out a way to work together, eventually they might be able to bring together what was once the United Kingdom. And presumably this was Yehoshaphat's intent. But we are constantly and repeatedly shown how Yehoshaphat was loyal to God, was faithful to God, and Ahab was anything but. And Yehoshaphat apparently, one would imagine, took a calculated risk, assuming that it was worth the risk of associating with an evil person like Ahab in order to achieve unity. And is this a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not going to answer this question easily, and neither will these verses answer this question, but it will leave us wondering. One thing is clear. We were given a positive presentation of Ovadiahu, the Navi, the prophet, who was, for staying in Ahab's house despite the depravity, and we were shown how he achieved a tremendous salvation. He saved 500 prophets from the wrath of Ahab and Izebel, and he accomplished great things. And we see how Eliyahu was somewhat chastised for not taking that approach, for taking the approach of not associating with an evil person. However, there is a difference between the two. And one of the main differences, the job of a prophet is the job to rebuke the people and bring them close. And that means no matter how far they went, you have to engage them in order to bring them back. What is the job of a politician, really, the king, Yehoshaphat? Is it his job to associate himself with Ahab in order to bring out unity? Or is it his job to say, I would love to bring about unity, but I can't bring about unity with someone like Ahab, who will end up bringing terrible influence to the people of Judah, who will end up making it hard to continue the worship of God and keeping idol worship and so on out of Yehuda. As we will see later in history, this marriage, which actually became a marriage between the children of Yehoshaphat and Ahab, ended up leading to tremendous problems in Yehuda later on, and we'll get there as we study the second book of Kings. So this is something to think about. So on the one hand, we feel somewhat hopeful. On the other hand, we worry about Yehoshaphat and his decisions. Is this a good decision or not? The verses that we're reading now clearly present Yehoshaphat as a righteous man. But nonetheless, he decided to go to war and disregard the warnings of Michayahu. And the Abarbanel points out that Yehoshaphat was never instructed not to go to war. And he wasn't the one who was told that he was going to kill and he'd get killed. It was Ahab, and it was Ahab's So he was never quite told by Michael, don't go to war. You're going to win, right? But Achav will meet his end. Vayomer Melech Yisrael el Yehoshaphat. This is page 30, verse 30, pasuk lamed. So the king Achav is trying to figure out a way to circumvent the prediction of the prophet. So he decides on a trick. He says to Yehoshaphat, "Hitchapes vavo b'milchama." I will get dressed up in costume. I'll dress like a regular soldier as opposed to dressing like the king, and that's how I will go to war. But you can dress like the king. This is almost like, this is quite condescending, and worse than that, I don't even know the right word for that, because he's really putting Yehoshaphat in a position where people will think that Yehoshaphat is the king, and that they will go after him. But Yehoshaphat nonetheless agrees to this plan. So the king of Israel goes in a disguise and comes to battle like that. So he's thinking, well, they said the king is going to die, but that won't be me because they're not going to know that I'm the king. Umelech Aram, and the king of Aram, that's Ben-Hadad, tziva et sorei harechav asher lo. He put out a command to the officers that were in charge of his chariots. He had 32 officers in charge of his groups of chariots. Lamar as follows: Lo tilachamu et katon v'et gadol. Don't bother waging war against the big people and the little people. Don't seek out all of the big challenging warriors of the Israelites. Don't try to wipe out the foot soldiers. However, your goal should be ki'im et melech Yisrael avado. I want you to kill the king of Israel himself. Now, on the surface, this is remarkable, because the king of Israel was the one who saved his life. And if anything, he should have gratitude to the king of Israel. Remember, it wasn't long ago that the king of Israel had Achav had Ben-Hadad surrounded. He was taking refuge in a house, being chased down. His armies were decimated by the people of Israel, and Achav nonetheless spared his life. So on the surface, it seems quite surprising that he should have such a vendetta against the king. However, if one digs a little bit below the surface, it's not surprising at all. Because people like Ben-Hadad, narcissists like Ben-Hadad, can't stand having someone around to whom they owe anything. They don't want, it's such a harm to their ego to know that the only reason why they're alive, and the only reason why they're still a king, and the only reason why they're still powerful is because of Achav. So the hatred that he has to Achav significantly overwhelms any shred of gratitude that he might have. He needs to get rid of Achav so that people cannot think that he owes his greatness to Achav. He has to be great because he's the greatest. And if you think about the psychology of the way people like this work, it makes a lot of sense, because that's the way narcissistic, dictatorial megalomaniacs think. So they can't owe their ascent to power to anyone else except themselves and their own perceived self-greatness. So this is verse 32. So when the officers that were leading the chariots saw Yehoshaphat, and they said, Ach melech Yisrael, he must be the king of Israel. So they immediately charged towards him. Vayizak Yehoshaphat, and Yehoshaphat called out, because he was worried. Of course, they were coming after him. However, immediately as he called out, as soon as they saw that he is not the king of Israel, they turned around. Now, exactly what it was that they saw that indicated that he was not the king of Israel is unclear. One interesting way of understanding it, that many of the commentaries and Chazal say, is, well, he called out to God. Achav is not the kind of guy to call out to God. He would call out to Baal or something else. Or it could be that it was his language and his speech that they could tell. As we know from other places, there were already different dialects of Hebrew being spoken in the north and the south, and they were able to tell from the way he spoke. Or maybe they recognized his voice as Yehoshaphat, which is unlikely in days before internet connections and cable news. So, but regardless, it was evident from his call, from Yehoshaphat's reaction, that he was not Achav. So they turned around. So verse 34, V'ish mashach bakeshet litumo. And there was a guy a soldier on the side of the Arameans, who at war he pulled back his bow to shoot at the Israelites because he was a soldier and he was just happened to be shooting at towards the Israelites. And it just so happened by Aket Melech Yisrael, and that arrow struck the king of Israel, Achav bein hadvakim, between the layers of his armor, uvein hashiryon, between the plates of the armor, you know. Vayomer lirakavo, and he said, so the king says to the one who was riding his chariot, Hafoch yadcha v'hotzi'eni min hamachne ki hachalesi. Turn around and take me out of the formation, of the camp formation, because I have been wounded, I am hurt. So he turned out, and then the battle raged, as the soldiers were fighting with each other, and the two formations came into each other. And the king, Achav, and obviously most of his soldiers knew that he was the king, stood, and the verse is purposely portraying Achav in a valiant, heroic way. Despite his injury, he stood up and faced Aram to show that I'm still fighting, I'm still leading. Vayamos ba'erev, however, despite standing that way and standing to the last moment, leading his troops, he still died in the evening. Vayitzek dam hamaka al chekarechav, and the blood from his wound flowed down into the chariot, into the area within the chariot where his blood collected. Vayavor harino b'machane, and the shout, the announcement went out among the camp, kivo hashemesh, as the sun came down, lemar, as follows: Ish el iro v'ish el arto. Everyone return to your cities, return to your land. The battle is over. Vayamos hamelech, and the king died. Vayavo Shomron, and they brought his body to Shomron. Vayikbru es hamelech b'Shomron, and they buried him in Shomron, which is the capital of Israel. There's not a lot of detail here as to who won the battle. One gets the sense that there was some sort of victory here on the part of the people of Israel, but not necessarily a resounding victory. But one gets the more important sense that we really don't care. That's really not important. What's important is what happened. And that is that Achav was wounded. Despite his wounds, his mortal wound, he stood and led the people to the last moment. And nonetheless, he died. And now, Vayishtofes Arechav al Brechas Shomron, because his chariot was, the royal chariot was full of blood, they rinsed it out at the pool of Shomron. Vayiloku haklovim et damo, and the dogs licked up his blood. V'hazonot rachatzu, and the prostitutes washed themselves. Apparently, they washed themselves in that pool. Kidvar Adonai asher diber, like the word of God that had been spoken. Now we read about the word of God saying that his blood will be licked by dogs. This thing about the prostitutes is something else, just another way of showing how demeaned he was at the end, how he was killed in battle. Now, it's interesting how the verses portray Achav as a hero, as someone who fought to the end, but nonetheless deserved to suffer this ignominious fate, this fate of someone whose blood is licked by the dogs because of his although he may have been a heroic leader in battle, which is presented as a positive thing overall, the way he led his people and the way he led them away from God, and his treachery against God, against the prophets of God, against the worship of God, and against the fundamental purpose of the people of Israel, was something that is never going to be excused. The Yeser Divrei Achav, and the all the other things about Achav, and all of the things that he did, and if you want to read about his ivory home that he built, some sort of a house that he built out of ivory, and all of the cities that he built, that's not the purpose here. If you want to read about them, go ahead and read in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. You can read all about it. Vayishkav Achav avotav, and Achav passed on and laid with his fathers. Vayimloch Achazyahu v'no tachtav, and Achazyahu his son ruled after him. So that was the end of the career of Achav. And as usual, the writer of the Book of Kings it's not a book of history. It wanted to portray the important characteristics of these leaders so that we can either learn from them, from the good parts, or learn from them, what they did wrong and how to not follow in those paths. Verse 41, Yehoshaphat ben Asa, Yehoshaphat, who we were introduced to, was the son of Asa, Malach al Yehuda. He was the king over Yehuda. He became king Bishnat Arba Lachav Melech Yisrael, in the 4th year of the reign of Ahab. Yehoshaphat ben 35 shana b'malcho. When he was appointed king, he was 35 years old. V'yasrim shana, and he ruled for 25 years. Malach b'Yerushalayim, he was a king in Jerusalem. V'shem imo, and his mother's name was Azuvah bat Shilchi, was Azuvah, the daughter of Shilchi. So it's giving so that we can reference and understand, where Yehoshaphat stood in the chronology of the kings of Israel, and each one compared to each other. Vayelach b'chol derech Asa aviv, and he went on the paths of his father Asa. Lo sar mimenu, he did not turn from that path. La'asot hayashar be'einei Adonai, to do what was proper in the eyes of God. However, no one's perfect. Achabamot lo saru, despite his path, which was to do what was proper in the eyes of God, he did not take away the bamot. The bamot are the high places, the shrines. They were shrines, they're understood to be shrines dedicated to God. However, God had instructed the people only to bring sacrifices and worship at the temple alone. But still, the people continued, even under Yehoshaphat, to have their parallel temples scattered around the countryside. The people were still bringing sacrifices and incense on those that were offered at those special shrines, despite, and Yehoshaphat allowed that practice to continue, despite God's explicit instructions not to do that. Vayashlem Yehoshaphat melech Yisrael, and Yehoshaphat had made peace with the king of Israel, which we had just witnessed in the story before. Is this good or bad? Let's see. We don't know. The verses aren't really going to deal with that here. It's going to deal with that in a lot more detail in the book of Chronicles, which we will, God willing, study after we finish the book of Kings. Vayashlem Yehoshaphat melech Yisrael, we just read V'yeser divrei Yehoshaphat, and all the words, if you want to read all about the things that Yehoshaphat did, Ugvuraso, and his might, Asher Asa, Vasher Nilcham, and the battles that he fought, Halohem Ketuvim al Sefer Divrei Hayamim Malchei Yehuda. You're welcome to go read the Chronicles and the Annals of the Kings of Judah, and you can read what you need to read there. V'yeser HaKodesh, Asher Nish'ar, Bimei Asa Aviv. Asa Aviv, who was a holy person, who was a good king, a righteous king, had still allowed some of this cultic prostitution continue, but he, Bi'er Min Aretz, Yehoshaphat got rid of that. So Yehoshaphat advanced the godliness and morality farther than his father, who was also a righteous person, but he moved it even farther, moved the needle a little more in the right direction. These next several verses are kind of interesting as to why they're thrown in over here, because we're not really clear as to why they're thrown in. But because the details are left out, there's more details in the book of Chronicles, but this is what we say. Melech ein be'edom nitzav melech. And at this time, there was no actual, or at least there was no independent king in Edom. Now, Edom had been conquered by David, and for the generations after David, it was a vassal state to Judah. So there was no independent king, but rather there was a nitzav. There was an appointed governor over the Edomites who paid tribute to the people of Judah. And that's just a fact that happened to still exist in Yehoshaphat's time. As Yehoshaphat's descendants left the path of God and went in the wrong direction, they lost their power over Edom, and Edom became independent and became an enemy again. But that's to happen later. That's not mentioned here. But during Yehoshaphat's day, there was no king in Edom. It was still a vassal to Judah. Verse 49, Yehoshaphat, that's just like a little reference. Why it throws that out here is unclear, but it's just something to remember, like a little note, something to remember about Yehoshaphat's reign. Yehoshaphat also, something else to remember about his reign, was that he made Aniyot Tarshish ships, which seems to mean some kind of style of sailing ship, vessel, Lolechet Ophir Lazav, for the purpose of traveling to Ophir in order to obtain gold. V'lo halach, but they did not go, ki nishbru aniyos be'etzion gaver, because the ships broke down at Etzion Gaver. So he never managed to launch these ships. So that's an unsuccessful part of Yehoshaphat's reign, again, which we'll learn more detail about later in Divrei Hayamim. But here it's just reminding us of this unfortunate episode in Yehoshaphat's life. Az Amar Achazyahu ben Achav el Yehoshaphat, and at that time, Achazyahu, who was the son of Achav, who we learned took over from his father Achav in the north, he said to Yehoshaphat, Yelchu avadayim avadacha bainos. Let's do it together. Let's make a navy together. V'lo ava Yehoshaphat, but Yehoshaphat did not want that to happen, did not let that happen. Again, more details later. And in Divrei Hayamim we'll read about how Yehoshaphat was criticized by the prophets for his alliance with the north, and because the north was full of wicked people. But here it deliberately leaves out that commentary. V'yishkav Yehoshaphat im avosav, and Yehoshaphat died and laid with his forefathers. Vayikaver im avosav be'ir David, and he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David, Aviv, David his ancestor. Vayimloch Yehoram beno tachtav, and his son Yehoram took over as king after him. Achazyahu ben Achav melech al Yisrael b'Shomron, and Achazyahu, the son of Achav, he was the king over Israel and Shomron. B'shnat sheva Yisrael Yehoshaphat melech Yehuda, and he became king in the 17th year of Yehoshaphat's reign. Yehoshaphat, the king of Judah, vayimloch al Yisrael shnasayim, and he was the king over Israel for 2 years. Vayas harab be'einei Adonai, and he did evil in the eyes of God. Vayelech v'derech avivu v'derech imo, and he followed in the path of his father and his mother. Uv'derech Yeravam ben Nevat, and in the path of the first king of Israel, Yeravam the son of Nevat, Asher achtias Yisrael, that he led the people of Israel on the wrong and sinful path. Vayavod es Baal, and he worshipped the Baal. Vayishtach v'lo, and bowed to it. Vayach'es es Adonai Elohei Yisrael kechol asher aso aviv, and he made God angry in all the ways that his father had done. So this concludes the first book of Kings, chapter 22, with the death of Yehoshaphat, who passes on the kingdom to his son Yehoram. We don't know Yehoram what kind of life he will lead yet, but we'll find out. And how Achazyahu and how Yehoshaphat was a righteous king, and how he, although he made a couple of mistakes, but he was a righteous king, he tried to bring out unity. Achazyahu, the son of Achav, also passes on and is buried, and as we'll learn later, handed over the kingdom to the next in line for Achav. So this concludes the first book of Kings. Thank you so much for studying this together with me. Looking forward to studying the second book of Kings, and have a wonderful day.